Good morning, Vietnam. Sorry, lack the charisma of the late, great Robin Williams, but I mean, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Zachary Taylor, and I'm a doctoral candidate here at Ohio University in the Contemporary History Institute. I'm happy to welcome you to the second day of this year's Baker Peace Conference. The first panel today focuses on Cold War allies. Although the Vietnam War came to an end in 1975, the major superpowers remained heavily involved in the region. We will hear presentations on the United States, the Soviet Union, and China from three distinguished scholars. Our fourth scholar, Amanda Demmer, unfortunately could not be with us today. Our first speaker, Dr. Xiao Bing Li, is a historian at the University of Central Oklahoma and an expert of Chinese-Vietnamese relations. Our second speaker, Dr. Ingo Trauschweizer, is a historian here at Ohio University and is an expert in military history and the global Cold War. Our final speaker, Dr. Sergey Radchenko, is a historian at Johns Hopkins University, well known for his scholarship on the Soviet Union and its operations in Asia. Since this panel includes three presentations, we will aim to keep each talk to around 20 to 25 minutes to allow time for question and answer at the end. With that, I would like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Xiao Bing Li, to the podium.
Good morning. All the speakers talk about China yesterday, about a love and hate story. They described China as a supporter, friend, brother, and comrade in arms. They also called China a threat, invader, evil, and the worst enemy. Well, they're all right, because China changed his policy during and after Vietnam War. This paper is about the game change of the People's Republic of China from 1975 to 1985. On May 2nd, 1975, more than 20,000 Chinese government officials, military generals, and community leaders held a grand rally in Tiananmen Square, Beijing, to celebrate the Vietnamese Communist forces in taking over Saigon and North Vietnam. Why the PRC government and the Chinese people were excited about the victory of Vietnamese and Cambodian communists in 1975. What did China celebrate for? Chinese people and their government were glad to see the end of the Second and Third Vietnam War, since China's assistance to North Vietnam had inflicted a heavy toll on Chinese economy. Chinese assistance to North Vietnam was substantial when China's own national power was limited. China battled the serious economic depression known as the 3 hard years in 1960. Shortage of food, fuel, and other daily needs claimed the lives of millions. Starvation became a nationwide phenomenon. All the animals despaired. Sorry, no more pandas. No bird was seen in the sky, and even grass and leaves were gone. Some estimated the death of 23 to 30 millions of Chinese people by the end of the Great Famine. From the early 1970s, detrimental economic impact of the Chinese Cultural Revolution since 1966 also became increasingly apparent, pushing China to the brink of economic bankruptcy. When Li Duan visited Beijing as a leader of unified and independent Vietnam in September 1975, Chinese leader Mao Zedong told him that, "Today, you are not the poorest under the heaven. We are the poorest." Mao's message was clear, and the Vietnam War had drained out the national resources of China. To help North Vietnam win the war, Beijing increased his military aid to Hanoi by mobilizing the entire country for China's war to assist Vietnam and resist America. According to official Chinese history, China provided all kinds of assistance to Vietnam from 1960 to 1975, totaled $20 billion US. For instance, China provided Vietnam with 2 million tons of grain in 1965-1970, and the total increased to 3 million tons in 1970-75. About 56,000 tons of cotton was sent to Vietnam in 65 to 70, and total increased to 71,000 tons in 1970-75. From 65 to 70, China provided Vietnam with 95,000 tons of gasoline, and the total increased to 1.8 million tons of gasoline in 1970-1975. I became an oil worker in 1972 when Hanoi requested complete service life of fuel, including shipment, storage, and protection of petrol products. Our corporation organized a working force of 1,200 men who worked on 3 oil supply projects, including building large oil tanks for storage in natural caves in the north, and making mobile oil tanks for military movement and operation along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It's interesting to notice that before China invaded Vietnam in 1979, Chinese military intelligence and PLA Air Force visited our oil engineers and discussed how to destroy those Chinese-made oil tanks in the caves of Long Son. Because of a hidden location and small entry, they decided to attack those tanks with air-to-surface guided missile. In the summer of 1966, the third phase of Rolling Thunder got underway. According to Ronald Frankham, the U.S. bombing began targeting the POL, petroleum, oil, and lubricants storage facilities. By that fall, Earl Tilford states that estimated about 70% of North Vietnam's POL storage capacity had been destroyed. Many of our oil workers did not make it back home through the Operation Rolling Thunder. We were so released when the war was ended in 1975. However, Shao Xiao and Xiao Bing Li pointed that Beijing's aid was based on China's strategic calculation rather than on Hanoi's needs. China's aid to North Vietnam helped Beijing to make a strategic shift from the United States to Soviet Union as its major security threat. As the U.S. withdrew from Vietnam, Chinese leaders believed that the Soviet Union filled in the power vacuum and replaced the U.S. as a new imperialist aggressor. Therefore, China became one of the targets and a victim of the new Soviet imperialist policy. Their strategic conception made sense to PLA generals who witnessed increasing Soviet hostility along the Sino-Russian border as a direct threat to their country in 1969. From 1969 to 1972, China fought 2 wars against 2 superpowers at the same time. the United States, and Soviet Union. To his south, the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese army, sent 430,000 troops to Vietnam and Laos to fight against American armed forces beginning in 1965. If a U.S. ground force invaded the North, China prepared to fully intervene in Vietnam as it did in Korea. To his north, along the Sino-Russian border in Xinjiang and Heilongjiang, the PLA fought against the Soviet forces from 1969 to 1972. The Soviet Union deployed up to 48 divisions, nearly 1 million troops along the Chinese border. Reportedly, Moscow considered using a preemptive nuclear strike against Beijing. China prepared for total war, including possible Russian nuclear attack. As a result of his frequent engagement against Soviet Red Army, the PLA increased to more than 6 million men, the highest point in his history. I was conscripted into the PLA in 1969. The Soviet threat and conflicts pushed Chinese leaders to improve their relations with the United States. China's vital role in Henei's war offered a good opportunity for Mao's strategic shift, since Washington needed Beijing to put pressure on Henei to return to the negotiating table in Paris. As a PLA soldier, we had daily drill, morning shooting practice. So before the war, the war against Soviet Union, we had a shooting target against Americans. Americans coming. Chinese army prepared war against Americans. So we paint the target like Nixon, big eyes, blue eyes, big nose. Overnight, they changed the policy. We were told Americans not coming, Russians coming. So we have to change the target, repaint the target like a Brezhnev. Pretty much the same, big nose, blue eyes. So Russians coming. So we were confused, but that was the strategic shift. The strategic shift eventually led to the normalization of Sino-American relations in the 1970s when Richard Nixon visited Beijing in February 1972. In terms of the impact it had upon East Asia and the global Cold War, the Sino-American rapprochement dramatically shifted the balance between the two superpowers in the Cold War. The United States and Soviet Union began to use the China card and played a different game in a new triangular relations during the late 1970s, the beginning of the end of the Cold War. To play the American card, Mao avoided a reconciliation with the Soviet Union after the end of the Third Vietnam War to gain a strategic advantage in the Sino-Soviet-US triangle. Mao continued his anti-Moscow agenda and used Cambodia to check on pro-Soviet Vietnam. On June 21st, 1975, Pol Pot visited Beijing and received the hero welcome from his ideological mentor, Mao Zedong. Mao fully approved Pol Pot's radical plans for Cambodia before Mao died in 1976. Post-Mao leaders Hua Guofeng continued China's support to Khmer Rouge, which led to China's predicament in dealing with Vietnam and sowed the seed for a catastrophic war against Henei in 1979. The increasing conflict between Moscow and Beijing had a major impact on Soviet-Vietnamese relations. Nicholas Koo pointed out that the Sino-Russian border war caused new Soviet leaders to take a more effective approach to undermining Chinese influence in North Vietnam. Henei considered normalized diplomatic relations between China and the United States on January 1st, 1979, as a betrayal on China's part. It turned out that after committing much of China's resources to supporting the Vietnamese communists, Beijing had created a new enemy, and the comprehensive confrontation characterized the relations between Beijing and Hubei through the 1970s. In this sense, the Vietnam War was also a lost war for China. The two countries immediately fell into a series of disputes after the Vietnamese communists won their country's unification. Since Vietnam aligned with China's principal enemy, now Hubei became Beijing's secondary enemy. Since 1975, the border conflict began and tension mounted. At least 100 border skirmishes occurred in 1974 alone. In 1978, Chinese sources reported 1,100 border incidents in which about 300 Chinese troops and civilians were killed. That same year, the PLA increased the border with 20 infantry divisions. In December 1977, Vietnam invaded Cambodia. China sought a good opportunity, not only because of Vietnam's weakened national defense, but also because of a moral justification for invasion. After he replaced Hua Guofeng, in January 1979, Deng Xiaoping paid a state visit to America. At a meeting with President Jimmy Carter, Deng told the American president, Asia is very unstable. At a meeting with Senate Foreign Affairs Committee on January 30, a senator asked if China would attack Vietnam since Beijing's supported government in Cambodia was overthrown and the country was in a serious crisis. Deng Xiaoping answered, "We will not allow Vietnam to make so many troubles." In early February, on his way back to China, Deng also told the Japanese Prime Minister, "To deal with Vietnam, it seems no effect but any other means than a necessary lesson." So Deng Xiaoping decided to teach Vietnam a lesson. On February 17, 1979, China sent 220,000 troops to invade Vietnam. Some Chinese generals called it a painful little war. Vietnamese troops avoided battle and instead harassed PLA forces. Some Chinese officials described it as a ghost war since the enemy troops were almost invisible. The Vietnamese troops employed the same tactics, made the same moves, and used the same weapons as the Chinese. They knew exactly what the Chinese were trying to do. They defeated Chinese invaders by the Chinese way of war. During the 19 days of the first part, the PLA suffered 26,000 casualties, about 1,300 deaths every day. 1,300 deaths every day for 19 days. Gerard Saigon pointed out that, in contrast to Korea, Chinese troops performed poorly. In Korea, they adequately defended North Korea, but in 1979, they failed to punish Vietnam. The Chinese withdrawal from Vietnam in March 1979 did not end the border conflict. The largest offensive campaign after 1979 took place in 1984, when the PLA overran Vietnamese positions in the Long Son Mountains. Until 1987, China reduced the scale of the border conflicts, and the war was over in 1988. To develop the border trade between the two countries after the war, the PLA troops in Guangxi and Yunnan began their larger-scale mine clearing operations along the Chinese-Vietnamese borders, where they have laid more than 4 million landmines against Vietnamese. Chairman Xiao Bing Li argued that the war had far-reaching influence and created the way for China's reform and opening up. First, China's invasion consolidated Deng Xiaoping's political leadership in the party and army. Secondly, China reclaimed his power status in Indochina after Vietnamese victory in 1975. The 20-year war in Vietnam tested the limits of Chinese military, especially his technology. Deng Xiaoping, as a new leader, had a new worldview and different policy. First, China's policy changed toward Indochina, shifted from ideological to national security. In November 1978, Deng Xiaoping visited Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and Burma. His effort to improve China's relations with Southeast Asian countries was described by Chinese media as an ice-breaking trip. Based on the requests made by those countries, the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, reduced his support to the communist parties in Southeast Asia. For instance, China formally asked the radio station of Thai Communist Party Center to stop their negative propaganda against the Thai government. When the Thai Communist Party refused to do so, China shut down Thai Communist secret radio station in Kunming, China's Yunnan province. Okay, the Thai Communist radio station in China. So Deng shut down their propaganda. In 1981, Deng ordered to shut down the secret radio station of Malayan Communist Party in Yiyang, Hunan province. Soon, Beijing stopped financial and military aid to Malayan Communist guerrilla troops. After China's invasion of Vietnam, the CCP's political bureau held a special meeting to discuss the Indochina issue and used the Indochina issue to improve Sino-Soviet relations in the summer of 1979. Finally, the Sino-Soviet deputy ambassador talks began in Moscow in October 1979. Secondly, China's policy shifted from his military-based policy with a confrontation in nature to diplomatic negotiation with possible economic cooperation. So here are several countries, but we see the increase generally all aboard. In 1982, Deng Xiaoping expressed his attempt to improve the relations with Soviet Union. In October 1982, Deputy Ambassador talks resumed in Beijing. Okay, so it started in 1979, but it's suspended when Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. So now they come back in 1982. Thereby, the Indo-Chinese issues became one of the channels to improve the Sino-Soviet relationship in 1980s. Thirdly, China developed new policy toward Indochina focused on geographic strategy and political stability. So Deng localized those issues instead of dealing with them as international issues. Like Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, always involved the Soviet Union, no more. This the local issue, globalization, global to local. Liu Jun pointed out that the Chinese government made major adjustments in their Indo-Chinese policy by ending the Sino-Vietnamese border conflicts and solving the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia for China's need for a peaceful international environment for his economic development and modernization. Deng Xiaoping intended to localize the Indo-Chinese issues without Soviet intervention and involvement. Deng announced in May 1985 at a meeting of military high command to end the party's propaganda and policy against Soviet Union. 1985, the end of the anti-Soviet policy. Next December, the Soviet leader promised Gorbachev to withdraw Russian troops from Afghanistan and improve relations with Beijing. Finally, as you know, Vietnam began to pull his troops from Cambodia in June 1988 and completed the withdrawal by 1989. In the summer of 1988, China normalized his diplomatic relations with Laos. And finally, in the summer of 1989, Deng Xiaoping met Gorbachev in Beijing, the end of the Sino-Soviet hostility since 1961. In conclusion, the decade from 1975 to 1985 became a historical turning point for a new China and the defining moment in Chinese history. The wars in Vietnam and Indochina and their aftermath brought tremendous change to the country. The war ended Mao's dictatorship from 1949 to 1976 and began Deng's oligarchy government from 1978 to 1989. China was never the same. Thank you.
Let's now welcome our second speaker, Dr. Ingo Trauschweizer, to the stage.
Thank you, Bing, for the reminder, too, that friendships and alliances in the 20th and maybe the 21st century are maybe fleeting and can shift in different directions. I wanted to commend Zach Givens for dressing up in the knowledge that I wouldn't and somebody from OU did, so that certainly was prudent. I had hoped that Amanda Demmer's talk on foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy, would help set some of the context for a talk on civil-military relations strategy and military affairs, so forgive me if some of that context may be missing, and of course ask about that in the Q&A if there are loose ends. So I'm investigating the question to what extent the U.S. military forgot to learn the lessons of Vietnam. And I put the lessons of Vietnam in scare quotes because it's not exactly clear what those were. And they kind of presented a sort of a moving target at different times due to the needs of the day rather than maybe deeper reflection on the conflict. I want to start in 2006, which I realize is well beyond the confines of the 1980s. David Petraeus, then an army general sort of enmeshed in the wars in Iraq, where he had served, in Afghanistan that he was thinking about, but at the time commanding the Army's intellectual hub at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, stage managed the production of a new field manual for counterinsurgency, which was to be both for the Army and the Marine Corps. And most of the writers were students of the war in Vietnam in one form or another. Petraeus himself had earned a doctorate from Princeton in 1987, with a dissertation on the American military and the lessons from Vietnam. By the way, for Americanists, it's pretty typical to just say Vietnam when they mean the Vietnam War, which is kind of an annoyance, but that is nevertheless the title of the dissertation. Now, if in 2006 counterinsurgency was all the rage, and it seemed that the armed forces had clearly missed the lesson that the Vietnam War had to offer on nation building, pacification, and counterinsurgency, it's actually curious that in the 80s, Major David Petraeus did not focus on that very much at all. He focused his work on other factors, most notably the political context of war. Roughly half of his dissertation didn't deal with the Vietnam War at all, but rather with how senior leadership in the military in the 70s and 80s had focused maybe too much on other factors, on caution, on no more Vietnams, which had become a kind of a mantra in political and military circles alike. So by the time he graduated, he had put the main conclusions before at least a kind of a military professional public and audience in an article, important article, I would say, in Parameters, the Journal of the Army War College, entitled The Lessons of History and the Lessons of Vietnam. And this was a critique of policymakers and generals and admirals who thought they could control the environment in future crises, deploy the armed forces only when it was clearly necessary, though that's, of course, a good idea, but also fully supported by the public, which, of course, could not always be guaranteed, and free of risk of stalemate and defeat. Now, to step out of this a little bit, lost wars in general, of course, tend to trigger more change in institutions. Victory does not tend to do that. So obviously there is ways in which the armed forces, and for that matter, the nation and national security establishment are deeply affected by the Vietnam War. But Petraeus, and this is why he plays in the lessons of history too, was sort of also warning against the assumption that you should always study the most recent war and assume that would provide a kind of a key to doing better in the next war. Sort of find the right historical analog, I guess, is what he would have said. And that's, I would go further. I would say studying any specific war and assuming that it's going to be a blueprint is problematic because you're almost certainly going to get something different. And your strategy, your operations, your procurement, your system might be too rigid. And again, a reminder in simple terms, what the lessons of the Vietnam War should have been for the US military has certainly changed over time. Now, to some extent, Petraeus was addressing a policy issue. In 1984, Ronald Reagan's Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, in a speech at the National Press Club, had outlined, I don't need to read the points, the conditions by which the US could go to war. Those had to be met. This becomes known as the Weinberger Doctrine. Some people kind of wonder whether it clashed with a Reagan doctrine or not clashed with a Reagan doctrine. And it's sort of curious because Caspar Weinberger was a hawk's hawk when it came to the Cold War, perfectly willing to spend lavishly on confronting the Soviet Union, on the nuclear arms race, on the armed forces, conventional as well as nuclear. Yet in some ways he also projected the attitude that anti-war wags had put on bumper stickers and buttons, as the one you can see here in the early 80s, proclaiming confidently that El Salvador was Spanish for Vietnam. So that was sort of the new No More Vietnams version in DC in the early 80s. And now the anti-war crowd and Weinberger would not have seen eye to eye on a lot of things, but they kind of agreed on that, right? You could get drawn into these quagmires, stalemates, whatever you want, incrementally, as they thought had happened to the US in the 60s, in Vietnam, because you don't really understand what's going to happen once you send advisors and then start maybe doing other things on top of that. Mission creep, in a sense. So for Weinberger, this meant, you wanted to deal with the Soviets in Germany, at sea, the air, maybe in space. For the anti-war regs, it probably meant something different in that respect. Weinberger's military aide at the time was Colin Powell. Powell later, towards the end of the Reagan administration, served as a national security advisor briefly. Reagan had quite a few of them. He then, if that's a promotion or sort of a sideways move, became chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in time for the first Iraq War. He added his own corollary or addendum, right? The clear exit strategy, the use of overwhelming force. But I will say that Powell was probably a little more willing to approve or even embrace the use of armed forces if those conditions were met, if there was a clear route to victory and to the exit. The other point is that the financial context of the armed forces was changing greatly in the 1980s. They were going through a cash-starved decade in the 70s, certainly the second half of the 70s in particular, and in fact they kind of got swamped with money, more than they knew how to prudently spend from about 1980 on forward. It's typically associated with Reagan. It really starts in the Carter administration in some ways due to that Soviet invasion of Afghanistan that was mentioned. And of course, if we want to be triumphalists and if we want to pretend, falsely I think, that history is kind of a linear progression, we could go to 1991 and we could say, well, the Vietnam War no longer mattered at all. That's what George Herbert Walker Bush, in a sense, tells us, right? In the wake of that triumph of American arms and technology in the desert of Kuwait and southern Iraq, the Vietnam syndrome had been kicked once and for all. Fill in your kicked where. He was too polite for that, I suppose, being a New Englander by way of Texas. So quite a change. But I would guard against that because people who make that argument, generally speaking, then assume everything that happened from about the early 70s on kind of leads to 1991. And you kind of streamline decisions that are much more contingent and contested into this narrative. And people who do that, generally speaking, fixate on the so-called revolution in military affairs, which I would argue did happen. That is, weapons and communication systems that were so much better, faster, and deeper in reach that there's a quantum leap in operations. It's not surprising that the Army, in its official history of the Iraq War, or for its official history of the Iraq War, chose the title Certain Victory. There was no doubt about it. What they didn't ponder was that they had gotten, in essence, kind of the farm team of the enemy they had prepared for or against, and the circumstances were almost ideal for the kind of warfare they had planned elsewhere. And that might not work out so well in other places, as of course they would learn a decade on in Iraq and in Afghanistan. In fact, one of the Army's own critics of the Army's official history, Colonel Richard Swain, called it a lucky victory, and he might have been right about that. So I want to say two things here. One is guard against the linear triumphalist narrative, but also don't necessarily assume that missing the lessons of counterinsurgency is the big story either, as it would appear to be in the 2000s, and that kind of informs the first slide, and that doctrinal manual of 2006, which kind of worked out in Iraq, less so in Afghanistan. So one size fits all certainly did not work. Instead, we really kind of ought to go back and see what happened in the 70s and early 80s and how did the armed forces cope. Well, one, from an American perspective, you can't start in 1975 and you can't end in 1985, I'm afraid. So you have to start around 1970. In the Nixon administration, the decision is made very clearly. One, the draft is going to be terminated at the conclusion of the American major deployment in Vietnam. That was a campaign promise of Nixon's that he followed through on. And for the armed forces, that meant two, well, there was going to be a significant drawdown as after all American wars, and a reconfiguration, right? And so you had to figure out how to do this. The military had to reorganize from partially drafted to all volunteer and professional, which may sound like a very good idea or a plus, since the armed services could now invest in training and education of men and women who were there to stay rather than just rotated through for 2 years. But the termination of the draft in 1973 really raised serious questions about recruitment and the quality of future soldiers. To some extent also sailors and airmen, although the Air Force and the Navy were going to be less affected by this, and Marines also less affected because they tended to rely more on volunteers to begin with, although they had drafted relatively heavily at the height of the Vietnam War. And so for the Army and Marines, this at first did not appear to work out well. Both services had to lower their standards, and the ongoing crisis in race relations, drug use, insubordination to the point of killing officers, fragging by grenades, and sort of general malaise were not really resolved until money started flowing more freely from about 1980 on. Related point is that this reorganization somehow had to work despite a major drawdown in numbers. All services lost a double-digit percentage of their personnel, though the Army was hit hardest by far, dropping from 1.6 million officers and men in 1970 to under 800,000 in 1975. Now you might say, well, those 783,000 or so no longer had to fight in Vietnam, so it's a wash. But they still had to guard Cold War frontiers in Germany and Korea, and they had other contingencies to worry about in other parts of the world, and really that was not sufficient a size. So you had to deal with that. And for that, the Pentagon had introduced an idea in 1970 known as the total force. What if you pretended that your reserve and your guard was actually ready to go? Because then you could simply hollow out the regular forces and fall back on reserve and guard. So for the Army, which kind of, I don't know, is forced to endorse this as the total Army concept, it meant that out of its 16 combat divisions, it had enough soldiers for about 10, and it worked that by running 2 brigades instead of 3 and assuming the 3rd would come from the National Guard if you deployed overseas. But of course, the Guard was underfunded and not ready. And the reserves, which had to take on a lot of the sort of sustaining and supporting functions, equally so. Now, the solution to that, of course, was more money, and the 80s were going to fix that, but they didn't know that yet, right? So there is that crisis to deal with. Then there is the lack of quality of manpower and, to some extent, woman power in the 70s, although women on the whole, since they really kind of volunteered into it in ways that weren't so much driven by economic conditions, tended to be on the brighter side of the spectrum. But many of the men that come into the service at that point really are kind of illiterate. In fact, so the Army and Marine Corps in the 70s find that altogether too many thousands of their soldiers could not read their doctrinal manuals, which at least in the Army's case were written at the 6th grade level, even if they had tried. And of course, that is problematic because training and education kind of go hand in hand, and if you can't read, you're sort of not really trainable in that form as easily. Of course, the good news is advertising can fix the image, and you can recruit that way. Although I have to say, I never figured out what today's Army wants to join you, the slogan of the 1970s, really meant. Probably nothing, though I do know it meant it got a lot of New York advertising agencies paid handsomely. Once again, I find some of us are in the wrong job. We could come up with something better for less money and still make a killing, metaphorically speaking, given the subject matter. So the issue is this, right? They're advertising kind of on a vacation-y feel of sun, serve, and careers. And that's no accident. Right? That's the pitch. The pitch is not, you may have to go to war or anything like that because they have a hard enough time bringing in people, as it were. The Army's problem is that anyone who sort of had the makings of a warrior would drift to the Marines, and anyone who had skills, technical skills, or an education would more likely join the Air Force or the Navy because there were more interesting jobs to be had. And so in 1980, in a congressional hearing about the state of things, the Army's Chief of Staff, General Edward C., known as Shy Meyer, calls the Army a hollow army. Now, what he meant was essentially, look, we basically don't have the combat battalions and brigades for our divisions, and we're lacking 10,000 non-commissioned officers, and we don't have enough junior officers either. But there is the wider issue that he kind of knew, that he had probably upward of 100,000 illiterates among his 800,000 soldiers. And so what he didn't know was that this was about to change, right? Because bring in money and recruit better better personnel. So in the course of the early 80s, the Army shifts in that respect. The slogan becomes "Be all you can be," which makes a little bit more sense. Money flows. The GI Bill, which had been cut off by Congress in the mid-70s, is reinstated. And so we're off to the races to the Army that wins. In the meantime, on the revolution in military affairs side, maybe technology could provide the silver bullet. The Air Force, and to some extent the Navy, find this really congenial. It kind of jives with arguments they have made about global striking power and reach from the early days of the Cold War. In fact, in the Air Force's perspective, really from about 1920 on forward, when air power advocates and strategic bombing advocates in the wake of the First World War in Italy, in Britain, and in the US started talking about killing factories from a distance and maybe killing their workers, and that would win future wars. So in some ways, this is kind of a silver bullet that had already not really quite worked that way in World War II, clearly not worked in Korea, clearly not worked in Vietnam, and yet the Air Force could simply say, look, we would have won the war, in fact did say, we would have won the war in Vietnam if only we'd been allowed to do so. They could kind of take Richard Nixon's position in retirement when he drafts his memoir and say, look, we told you so, right? If the Johnson administration had allowed us to do what Nixon allowed us to do, which was essentially to bomb the lives out of Hanoi in 1965, we would have won. That's, of course, entirely unprovable and probably not the case. But it gets you away from having to really reckon with what had gone wrong. And what enhances the technology argument is that even at the tail end of the Vietnam War, from about 1969-70 on, precision-guided munitions, laser-guided bombs, really beginning to look kind of smart, come into play, like the M117 Bolt, which is a guidance system you could direct from about 2.5 miles out. So basically you hover over a target, you drop your bomb, and then you can actually hit that target. Stealth technology, it works in similar ways in the sense that you could now approach undetected by radar. And the Air Force doubles down on its intercontinental capability by introducing the B-1 bomber, either for good measure, that's the Reagan administration's take, or unnecessary expense, that was Carter's, because the Air Force, of course, also invested in a new generation of intercontinental ballistic missiles, somewhat cynically known as the Peacemaker. One could make a similar argument about the Navy. Its nuclear submarines, the Trident missile system, submarine launched, its 600-ship fleet, its kind of reorientation from being forced in the Korean and Vietnam War eras to primarily support forces ashore to going back to being kind of the geopolitical actor at sea that can control seas, defeat enemy fleets, and get you where you needed to go. Or one could make the argument about the Army. Now, in light of Sopal's tremendous use of ChatGPT imagery, I want to point out this is an actual Army artwork, not something I fed into ChatGPT, although you wouldn't necessarily assume so, perhaps. I don't know what to call it. I will just say it depicts the so-called Big Five weapon systems and the man who was supposed to figure out how to make them work. So for the Army, the revolution in military affairs basically meant that this new outfit they had created, Training and Doctrine Command, new in 1973, was going to come up with new operational doctrine, ways to train and educate soldiers and officers, bring procurement into better alignment with that sort of doctrinal concept, which in essence is the way you think you're going to wage the next war, as a simple way to put it. And in 73 to 76, because TRADOC's commanders knew they were going to get the less well-desired end of society in their armed forces, they decided they needed something extremely prescriptive. So the first commander of that outfit, William Depew, creates a doctrine called active defense that basically scripts the first battle in Germany, because he thinks that's all his soldiers can learn, but he also thinks that's all the US Army and the US military more broadly is going to be able to fight because the new technology hasn't arrived yet. His successor, Don Starry, is a somewhat different mindset, but he also has the benefit from the late 70s on of knowing that weapon systems like the Abrams tank, the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, which in fact had been in the works for 25 years, the Vietnam War may have had something to do with the delays, attack helicopters, utility helicopters, the Patriot missile defense system, multiple launch missile launchers for offensive operations would basically allow you to change the battlefield from a linear broad front to depth. And because he's also thinking about war in Germany, you really only have, I don't know, 400 miles or so that you need to worry about in depth, in breadth, from the Baltic Sea to the Alps. It's actually probably less than that. I'm trying to convert kilometers to miles in my head, and it's not working out, which once again reaffirms I should not have become a mathematician, and I didn't. But the idea was now you could attack Soviet follow-on echelons as far east as Belarus, while you were fighting frontline forces near the Iron Curtain, the intra-German border. Whether that would have actually worked is a different matter, right? But Starry has the hope in this concept called air-land battle of the early 80s that you could actually maybe hold out beyond the first battle, might not have to go nuclear, whereas the Pew had kind of figured, well, you were going to lose the first battle at some point, but maybe you could save enough of your forces in some of Western Europe before the war went nuclear and may have led to some other kind of resolution. Now, what people have though, so this is a relatively well-known story for military historians. What's less well known is the training side to this. There is, in fact, a kind of a training revolution that spans across all of the services. And we ought to pay more attention to this. For the Air Force, in a way following the Navy's lead with its Top Gun school, which itself had begun in 1969, that meant red flag exercises, which since November 1975 have been held, I think, annually or biannually in the skies over Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, more recently also in Alaska. And the basic idea is that fighter pilots could gain experience against so-called aggressors flying Soviet MiGs. Welcome to the danger zone indeed, but in a controlled environment, and I wasn't going to sing, so you don't have to worry about that. The idea was that they had recognized in Vietnam in particular that it was the first 3 or 4 combat missions where losses were heaviest. And if you could simulate that, you would put pilots and crews into combat in a way with enough experience that they could, again, pardon the pun, go on autopilot and sort of work through and let muscle memory do its thing. The Marines will go a different route. I'll come to that in a second. The Navy adds a junior officer training school, surface warfare school at Newport, Rhode Island, to the Top Gun outfit because a lot of its surface warfare officers were sort of thinking they were undertrained. The Army creates the National Training Center in the Mojave Desert in Southern California. The difference there is instead of individual pilots and crews, it is entire battalions that go there, rotate through, go up against aggressor squadrons of Soviet armor. In fact, one of our current PhD students was recently there commanding one of those aggressor squadrons that have been reinstated. In the meantime, in the 2000s, much of this was converted to faux Iraqi villages where you could sort of engage with the possibility of insurgent tactics. And at the intellectual end, the Army introduces a second-year course at the Command and General Staff College. That's basically a full-blown master's degree in military science, known as the School of Advanced Military Studies in 1981. The Marines do something similar to School of Advanced Warfighting, I think in 1990, revamped the Marine Corps War College in Quantico. The Air Force adds to its Air University by way of the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies. And so maybe the Army's take on this is right, and the mind is the key to victory. Or not, because victory didn't necessarily follow, but that at least is the idea. So there's one more component to this before I conclude, and that is the civil-military relations side, but also command structure, which is where Congress comes in particular, the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986. One major lesson of the Vietnam War that had not been addressed was that the command hierarchy had been woeful. The ground commander in South Vietnam, first William Westmoreland, later Creighton Abrams, was not controlling a theater. He was not controlling the air war in Laos, in Cambodia, or North Vietnam. Pacific Command, that was theoretically commanding the theater, was sort of being kind of bypassed and used just as a communications link, both from Vietnam on out and from the Joint Chiefs of Staff on in. And on top of that, you had White House staff that was meddling with clearly operational points. For example, Lyndon Johnson's Tuesday Luncheon Group, which initially included no military figures, signing off on bombing targets in North Vietnam. Later, Nixon's and Kissinger's staffs handling the so-called secret war in Cambodia. If you want to know how to keep a war secret, of course it wasn't, but there was sort of deniability enough. Plus, there was the rivalry between the armed services that had been a prominent feature of the 50s and 60s that now threatened to return if it indeed had ever subsided. So Goldwater-Nichols kind of tries to fix that, right? With the combatant command structures, one commander for the theater, all component pieces, no matter what service they were from, under that commander. The service chief not being able to tell his or her guys or gals that they shouldn't really follow this commander, which had been possible in the old function because, well, that's still the chain of command. But that introduced its own problems. And so maybe Goldwater-Nichols came to the rescue, maybe it made things worse. We don't really quite know yet, although a lot of observers in the context of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have come to suspect the latter. An example for that is procurement was not really streamlined in ways that saved money. Look, for example, at the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter for all services, which initially all services thought, well, didn't really fill their needs. At the low cost, cradle to grave for the current F-35 Lightning II program of $2 trillion. I would submit you could cut something like that and maybe save some jobs, which are just a rounding error in the federal budget anyway, and let people get on with their lives. But in any case, so I'm not sure that I have fundamental conclusions to offer yet. I do hope to do so when it comes to writing a chapter. But it seems to me what lessons the military should have learned from the Vietnam War shifted over time, or at least their discourse shifts over time. At first, it was about no more Vietnams. Concurrently, and then subsequently, it became about the proper alignment of technology, doctrine, and training, but perhaps too narrowly tailored for a particular form of World War III in Germany, which I'm particularly happy didn't happen, having grown up there at that time. And much later, it became about counterinsurgency, the lesson that should have been learned, although I've read enough about the Vietnam War per se now that I kind of wonder about that, because it wasn't simply an insurgency that you would have won by better counterinsurgency, and there would have been trade-offs that we still haven't reckoned with. So we still have much to learn about all of this. And it seems to me that perhaps the disquieting thing is, I think the military did become more resilient and nimbler in this process, especially because of the training revolution. But no one really has addressed the strategy void. That is, what do you do with all this stuff in order to attain your political objective? And I think in some ways that was one of the problems of the American war effort in Vietnam too, if it was ever an attainable objective to begin with. So maybe that's the lesson we ought to reckon with the most. But we haven't because, well, we have committees for that, from the National Security Council to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. that interface or don't talk to one another that are supposed to do this. I'll close on that note, and I look forward to your questions.
And last but certainly not least, please join me in welcoming our final speaker for this panel, Dr. Sergey Radchenko.
There's already a laptop here, but maybe can I talk like this? Maybe this will work.
Here, I can just,
Here we go.
because you don't have slides, right?
I don't have slides, but I can.
Here, I'll just take this.
I'm saving paper, that's why I'm just dragging my laptop around instead of printing out my notes. Right, so thank you. It's a true pleasure and honor to be here. It's my first time in Ohio in general, first time at Ohio University, so I'm really glad to be able to participate. My only regret is not being here yesterday. I only arrived last night. Unfortunately, I had a prior commitment in Belgium, where I was actually at NATO's SHAPE headquarters, which is located in the 1960s building, a 1960s military base, complete with a nuclear bunker, you know, asbestos in the walls. And you go through this and you think, you know, this is a museum, but then it's full of generals, you know, people in military uniforms running here and there, and this is where when you suddenly realize that there's this connection between history and the present in so many ways that sometimes we don't fully understand and fully appreciate. So I will talk about the history of the conflict in Indochina and obviously the conflict extended for much longer than the American involvement there, as we know, from the 1940s all the way to the 1980s. I will focus on the Soviet side of this because the Soviet Union was involved there for years and years and years. And I will talk about it from the perspective of sort of a documentary adventure, documentary story. Let me talk a little bit about where what the state of the archives is when it comes to Indochina, when it comes to Vietnam, and when we talk about the Russian-Soviet archives. After the Cold War, there was a period of openness in the Russian archives, and this is where historians went to work with these documents. A lot of them were not particularly well organized at the time, and you had the first generation of histories emerge about the Vietnam War, books written by people like Ilya Gaiduk, late Ilya Gaiduk. Some of you would have read his work, based on those sources, and then all of that was closed down. All of that was closed down, not by Putin, by the way, by Yeltsin. And that also actually had something to do with Vietnam. And the story is not widely known, but there was an American researcher called Stephen Morris who later published a book called Why China Invaded Vietnam. Excuse me, Why Vietnam Invaded Cambodia, right? One of those. Anyway, one of those. It's a very good book. So while he was there, while he was researching in the archives, he found very interesting documents that showed the, if I get this right, the number of American POWs that the Vietnamese reported to the Soviets or shared with the Soviets that actually diverged from the number that the Vietnamese were telling the Americans, and that ended up in the New York Times, and the Clinton administration reached out to the Russians saying, "No, where? Can you give us the documents?" And anyway, so that caused a lot of noise. And in 1993, the Russian archives, where a lot of those documents were, basically closed down. Maybe not just because of that, but certainly this was a big contributing factor. Not to blame Stephen Morris at all for this. This is just how things work out sometimes. Anyway, in 2000s, there was, when I was working there in the early 2000s, things were not particularly good in Moscow. You could not actually get anything. The stuff you got was useless, and also they would not let you take photos, so you would have to write things down. Anyway, absolute disaster. But then approximately 2013, 2014 comes a huge shift. And suddenly the Russians reopen a massive amount of documentation on the Cold War, history, including on Indochina. And I would say the Indo-Chinese aspect is probably one of the best covered in those documents. So we're talking about what kind of archives? Well, mainly if we're talking about the Vietnam War, 1960s, 1970s, that's mainly in the Russian Contemporary Archive or Russian Archive of Contemporary History, which used to be located right next to the Red Square, but has now shifted across the Moscow River to the other side of the Moscow River, with a wonderful view of the Kremlin and a fantastic access to documents. And also they finally allow you to use the camera to go there and just take photos of stuff. Lots of stuff. Included in those documents were materials, including those that Stephen Morris, by the way, got in the early 1990s, and a lot more that covered every aspect of Moscow's relationship with Vietnam in the 1960s and through to about the mid-1970s. I'll touch on that in a second, why the mid-1970s, including, for example, every record of every meeting that the Soviet leadership had with Vietnamese leaders from the 1950s all the way to the 1970s. So, all the meetings with Ho Chi Minh, meetings with Pham Minh Dong, Le Duan, Le Tanguy, all of that amounting to thousands of pages of documents. So the entire story from the other side that has never been used by historians, except for, of course, Ilya Gaiduk, but he only had very limited access to this stuff. Also among the documents were reports of the Soviet embassy in Hanoi, almost daily reports, lots of reports on different aspects of the Vietnam War, but also the immediate post-war years. And to add to this, of course, the Soviets like to talk about Vietnam. It was a big issue for them from the 1960s onwards. It was a huge issue, so they talked about it with everyone. Like people like Castro. Fidel Castro would turn up in Moscow. What would they talk about? Of course, Vietnam. What else is there to talk about? Nixon would talk to Brezhnev about Vietnam, and there's a wonderful Soviet just a huge amount of records on this particular episode. I'll give you one example, which I think indicates how interesting it may be sometimes to study the Soviet record. So, in 1972, Richard Nixon comes to Moscow. That's May 1972. Has a meeting with Brezhnev. And, it was a nice meeting. They were having a wonderful conversation, very friendly, because Brezhnev really tried to build up rapport with Nixon. He wanted to promote détente, etc. And then suddenly Brezhnev just turns nasty, saying, you're bloody American imperialists, your hands are just blood up to your elbows, you're so terrible, what are you doing in Vietnam, you have to get out. Nixon writes in his memoirs that I was so shocked, he was so friendly, he was so nice, but then suddenly he started shouting. And then later he calmed down and everything went fine. So Nixon never figured this out, but what we can learn from the Soviet records, if you look at the Russian side of the story, is Brezhnev basically was trying to produce a record of conversation, which then he would show to Soviet allies. So Fidel Castro shows up in Moscow and he says, oh, here's the record of conversation with Nixon. We defended Vietnam because, of course, the Soviets were being seen as, or certainly the Chinese criticized them. Oh, you're selling, I mean, the Chinese should not have said anything. They themselves sold out Vietnam. But anyway, so among others, lots of people were criticizing the Soviets for détente, for selling out Vietnam. And so for Brezhnev, it was very important to show to the communist world that he was not. And so he read from this transcript of conversation with Nixon in internal party meetings. He showed it to Fidel Castro. He sent one of the Soviet officials, Nikolai Podgorny, over to Vietnam with the record to show to Lizuan. Look, we defended your honor and our honor, etc. This kind of stories, I think, really shed new light and add a lot of nuance to our understanding of the Soviet position in the Vietnam War, and also to the limits of the Soviet influence, what they could do, what they could not do. We get the entire story. It's really, really fascinating. That's not the end of the story. Among other records that you would find in Moscow are, and I don't know how they got this, right? This I don't know, but they have records of talks of the North Vietnamese Politburo. So you can imagine that they came via intelligence channels. So somehow they had their spies inside the North Vietnamese leadership. I don't know who it was, but actually I think I know who it was. It was Le Van Long, who was a Politburo member, and because it's mainly his speeches that the Soviets have. Maybe it wasn't him directly, maybe he's some aide or somebody, but somebody passed to the Soviets the statements that Le Van Long made at the North Vietnamese Politburo on a variety of issues of North Vietnamese military strategy, of how to deal with the United States, how to deal with whether or not to push the revolution forward. Here's, for example, one interesting element that you can learn from those documents. You learn from there the details of context between the Vietnamese communists and the Thai communists in Thailand, in their efforts to promote a revolution in Thailand in 1969, 1970. In fact, they were trying to organize an armed uprising in Thailand, and there's a great detail about their meetings, how they discussed organizing it, and I don't know why it didn't work out for them. Maybe something didn't work out. Something didn't work out. It could have worked out, maybe. This raises very interesting counterfactuals, interesting questions, because we are used to thinking about the domino theory as completely nuts, and that Eisenhower was full of it, and it would not, nothing would have ever happened. But if you look at it from using those Vietnamese records, you realize that a lot of those people, they were quite fanatical about promoting revolution, and were actually quite determined to do that. And then, did not necessarily or could not necessarily achieve the goals that they set themselves for a variety of reasons, but not for the lack of desire to do so, by the way, right? So that's just a slightly provocative take on the domino theory. Right, so Soviet policy towards Vietnam. Until about the mid-1960s, not particularly interested, not particularly. Nikita Khrushchev had multiple meetings with Ho Chi Minh, Vietnamese communists, and he just was trying to avoid conflict there, wasn't interested in providing too much Soviet aid. He was much more interested in the relationship with the United States, with the West. But then he was ousted in October 1964. You have a new Soviet leadership that comes into office, so people like Leonid Brezhnev and Alexei Kosygin. And those people really upped Soviet involvement in Vietnam in a major way, providing weapons, sending experts, and just really extending Soviet commitments in a way that was unthinkable under Khrushchev. The question is why they did that. In my view, it was because they were new in leadership. So they were looking for ways to prove that they were true revolutionaries, that they were committed to Vietnam that was fighting a war against American imperialism and so on and so forth. So they had to do that, right? Show their true colors, so to speak, and not be like Khrushchev, who didn't really care all that much. And also, they were really concerned about one factor that from the early 1960s dominates Soviet thinking about Asia, and that is China. They were worried about China. There was a falling out between themselves and the Chinese that went from bad to worse. The Chinese accused them of betraying revolution, and the Soviets, for strategic reasons as well as for ideological reasons, perhaps for reasons of supporting their claim to revolutionary leadership in the world communist movement, had to show that they were better than the Chinese and this is, Vietnam was the place where they carried out that struggle against the Chinese. But the Vietnamese played both sides because, of course, they understood that for them it was important to have both Chinese support and Soviet support. The Soviets provided some material support. The Chinese, as we heard from Li Xiao Bing, also provided material support, but also sent troops to Vietnam. But then Vietnam and China start to drift apart, and that it happened in part because of the Vietnamese appreciation for the Soviet military support. They wanted that. They thought that this would help them win the war, and certainly it contributed that to their victory in the end, but also because the Chinese, due to the Cultural Revolution, started to pursue the kind of radical policies that basically annoyed everybody in the world, including their closest friends and allies, the North Koreans and the Vietnamese. I mean, everybody thought the Chinese were crazy with their the Red Guards, all this revolutionary propaganda. It really annoyed the Vietnamese. So there's a drifting that occurs already in the 1960s, which then widens to something, well, not quite a rift, but certainly a great frustration on the part of Hanoi with what they see as China's betrayal of Vietnam after Kissinger's visit in 1971, about which, of course, the Vietnamese were not consulted. It was only after that Zhou Enlai reached out to the Vietnamese leaders, said, oh, by the way, Kissinger was here. What? How can you do that? How can you betray your ally in this kind of way? So there's something of a rift. At the same time, though, the Soviets also were trying to improve their relationship with the Americans, and Nixon also visited Moscow. I already recounted this episode. Then we have the move towards the Paris Peace Agreement and the Paris Agreement of January 1973, which after that the Americans obviously withdraw from Vietnam or begin their withdrawal from Vietnam, and Vietnam's relationship with the Soviet Union and China intensifies in various ways. What you have in the Russian archives is a very detailed account of this period from 1973 onwards. The Vietnamese begin shifting very clearly in the Soviet direction because they are worried about Chinese pressure. They're unhappy with the Chinese. They accuse the Chinese of trying to effectively take over Southeast Asia. And when in July 1973, Lizuan and Pham Van Dong traveled to Moscow, that's what they talk about with the Soviet leaders. There are a couple of hundred pages of their conversations, very intense conversations in July and August 1973, where they discuss China. And the Vietnamese basically say, well, the Chinese, they're trying to take over Southeast Asia. That's what they want to do. They have people there. They are trying to take over Cambodia. And they discuss, Lizuan and the Soviets, how the Chinese are trying to do that, acting through people like Pol Pot, etc. And Xiao Bing already mentioned this, right? So the Chinese obviously reach out to Cambodia and maintain their relationship with Pol Pot, which is, by the way, fascinating. We have from different sources, we have a record of Mao Zedong's conversation with Pol Pot in, I think it was June 21st, I believe June 21st, 1975. June 21st, 1975, Pol Pot is in Beijing. Mao Zedong is at that point quite old. And at that point, Mao tells Pol Pot that, I've got a quote here for you. "We approve of what you do. Your experience in many areas surpasses ours. China has no right to criticize you," says Chairman Mao to Pol Pot. and then Pol Pot. And then you know what they discuss? And this is crazy. When you look at this stuff, you think, you know, this is really bizarre. They discuss Marxist philosophy in the conversation. Mao Zedong and Pol Pot discuss Marxist philosophy. So Mao talks about Marx, he talks about Immanuel Kant, and then he also talks about Huxley, etc. Mao says here, Huxley was a materialist in his understanding of the natural sciences and idealism with regards to the social sciences. He endorsed Indian Buddhist philosophy. And then he tells Pol Pot, I've never said so much to other people the things I've said to you. And then Chairman Mao says, don't thank me, thank Marx and Lenin. There are 30 works of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin in big time that I wish to gift you. Marx and Lenin said it very well, better than myself. You know, when you read something like that, you think this is very strange, right? But it does show the dynamic, I guess, ideological understanding between Pol Pot and Mao, the way that Pol Pot took or saw Mao as a revolutionary example to follow, and Mao put his trust in Pol Pot even as he is basically on his deathbed, looking to Pol Pot for, you know, to continue revolution in Cambodia, obviously on China's behalf. Now, the Vietnamese were not happy about this, and they complained to the Soviets extensively in their conversations with the Soviets, saying, look what, you know, this Pol Pot, he's pro-Chinese, look what he's doing, the Chinese are supplying him, we still have some influence over him because the Chinese are providing him with weapons and so on and so forth, but we have to transport those weapons to him, so therefore we still have control over what he does. And I wouldn't say at this point that you have a complete rift between the Chinese and the Vietnamese. We're talking about 73, 74, 75, because, for example, in 73, the Chinese provided Vietnamese leaders with cash, with $130 million in cash. I just wonder what that would have looked like. $130 million in cash, and you think, what for? Turns out that it was to buy the South Vietnamese currency in order to operate in the revolutionary areas of South Vietnam. Just the use, you know, that's what that was used for. So there's more to this relationship. Yes, there's a lot of hatred, there's a lot of suspicion that is already building up by 73, 74, but still the Chinese are supplying, what, 100, you know, Xiao Bing was saying we're the poorest under the heaven, but we're supplying $130 million to the Vietnamese to buy, you know, to basically finance their guerrilla activities in South Vietnam. So very interesting. Anyway, then we come to about 1975, and here is where the situation with the study of Indochina and study of Vietnam using Soviet records unfortunately becomes much worse, because what we have in Moscow is we have Brezhnev's personal fonts or personal files where you can read all of this stuff comes, and it's very rich, very great texture, very interesting. All of that comes from Brezhnev's personal files because he met with all these people, and there would be records of conversations. Now, does he stop meeting with them in 1975? No. And, you know, meetings continue. There's a problem, however, and Brezhnev suffers from mental decline from about late 1974. And so his conversations become very short and meaningless. So he would meet with the Vietnamese instead of previous times where he would have, let's say, 60 pages worth during one particular conversation with Lizuan, 60 pages of stuff. They discuss everything, you know, America, Indochina, prospects for revolution, the Chinese, etc. This is early 1970s. You shift into the sort of late 1970s. There's nothing there. Brezhnev is no longer capable of actually operating in this kind of way. So he reads out from prepared texts and does not really respond very well. So you don't really actually have much of a communication. So that's why we don't have much in the Brezhnev font and beyond that, and that's too bad, because what is really interesting is to understand the role the Soviets play in the build-up to the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia. We have the signing of the Soviet-Vietnamese Defense Treaty, the fall of 1978, and we have some discussion or some records that we can now get from the East German archives that show that obviously China was discussed, Cambodia was discussed, the threat Cambodia poses to Indochina was discussed, threat in the sense of being base for Chinese influence, because that's what they're really worried about. That's why the Soviets are supporting the Vietnamese, and we're worried about the Chinese. They want to have all of Indochina under their control, and the Vietnamese obviously want to expel the Chinese influence from there, and they see the invasion of Cambodia as a way of doing that. But what we don't see in those records is we don't see any kind of discussion, how will the Chinese react to this, and what's going to happen? Because of course what we know is that after the Soviets invade, after the Vietnamese invade Cambodia, you have the Chinese effort to, quote unquote, teach them a lesson, and there's invasion by China into Vietnam. We don't have all that much in those records, the Soviet records, on the Soviet reaction to this. Obviously, the Soviets are growing increasingly paranoid about China, but they have been paranoid for a decade. They're worried about China. They had been worried about the Chinese invasion of the USSR from the late 1960s onwards. They are now worried about China and the United States acting hand in hand, and in fact, they suspect very much that it was the United States that approved the Chinese invasion of Vietnam. Now, we know that this is not the case because we have the records of Deng Xiaoping's conversations with President Carter, and Xiaobing already talked about them. We know that Deng Xiaoping raised this question in one of his conversations with Carter, and Carter kind of said, oh, well, he didn't say anything actually, but later he wrote a little note saying maybe this is not such a good idea. But the Soviets don't buy into this, right? So their view is that, no, there's some kind of a secret cooperation between the Chinese and the Americans. And together they're effectively, the Americans are blessing the Chinese invasion of Vietnam. So they're really worried about that. Now, what then happens is, obviously after the war and the Chinese pull out from Vietnam, you have a period of several years of tensions between China and Vietnam, and the Soviet record is virtually non-existent for that particular period. It picks up again from the late 1980s when you have Gorbachev who comes into power, and then you suddenly start having plenty of documents again that touch also on Vietnam, because of course the Chinese made the Vietnamese pullout from Cambodia a precondition for normalization of relations with the USSR. And the Soviets were saying, well, why do you bring in Vietnam into this? We don't have any influence there. And the Chinese would not buy this. So, no, you get the Vietnamese to pull out from Cambodia, then we'll normalize relations. That's what basically Beijing tells the Soviets in the late 1980s. But instead what we have is we have Chinese documents on Vietnam, and those are really interesting. And I can tell you where I got them. It's a funny story. When I lived in China, there was there's a Chinese kind of, obviously Chinese archives are not particularly open, so you cannot find much there, but there's I guess a science. It's not a science. In Chinese, it's called 垃圾学, study of garbage. And so if you study of garbage means going into old bookshops and finding, and believe it or not, it's, those bookshops when I lived in China were full of Chinese government documents. And so you would find government documents for the 1980s describing, for example, foreign ministry circulars describing China's policy towards Vietnam. And it's actually quite interesting to see what the Chinese were thinking about Vietnam. Obviously, they were thinking that Vietnam and the Soviets were trying to encircle China, you find in those documents a desire, certainly one of the documents that I looked at talked about the need to overthrow Lezuan. Even as early as the 1980s, they were trying to support some kind of a sponsor internal dissent against Lezuan and potentially organize a coup against him. Right, just to in the way of concluding, the Soviets, in a sense, were victors of what happened in Indochina as a result of American withdrawal. They were very happy. They felt that they defended their ally. It came at an enormous expense, of course, but they also acquired military bases. They wanted those bases. You could see them discussing that with the Vietnamese already in the early 1970s about taking over Cam Ranh Bay, for example. They ultimately acquired that facility. So it seems that on the one hand, they were a victor because they were able to pull Vietnam to their side and maintain this relationship with Vietnam until the 1980s, a very positive relationship. On the other hand, Vietnam was a huge economic burden on the USSR through the 1970s into the 1980s. If you read those conversations that Brezhnev had with the Vietnamese leaders, guess what comes up all the time? Can you give us more aid? Can you give us money? Can you cancel previous debts? Because we're so poor, we cannot pay them off. And the Soviets every time would have to do that. They would do it every time. They would write off billions and billions of rubles in aid, and then they would provide more aid. So that I have here an interesting piece of statistics for you from the Russian archives. Credits that Vietnam received from the Soviet Union amounted to 16.4 billion rubles by 1990, most of which was never repaid. What happened to it? Putin wrote it off later. Putin wrote it off. But this was one of the major, Vietnam was one of the major nations that owned the largest amount of debt to the Soviet Union. In addition, Soviet military aid to Vietnam in the 1980s was valued at over 4 billion rubles. And so it became a huge burden and a drag on the Soviet economy. And this is what Gorbachev realized in the 1980s, in the late 1980s, trying to reform the Soviet economy. He was asking this question: why do we need this kind of allies? They're just they take money from us and they're a drag on us. And so you see then, but money continued coming, but then in the end, the Soviets finally cut that off because they could no longer finance it. They simply had no more money towards the end of the 1980s. So such were the long-term fruits of the Soviet-Vietnamese victory in this war. And I'll end here. Thank you. Do we stay here?
Thank you so much to our speakers for those incredible histories. And we are now going to open up the floor for questions. There are microphones on either side of the room for anyone who would like to pose a question to our panelists.
Hello. First of all, thank you for coming. That was incredibly interesting to listen to, and I learned a lot I didn't particularly know. I have actually a couple questions. The first question is directed to Dr. Xiao Bing Li and Dr. Radchenko. When comparing the Soviet vision of global revolution with the Maoist vision of global revolution, how did both of their experiences in Vietnam shape those visions moving forward through the 60s, 70s, and 80s? And in the case of China, I suppose you can say beyond as well. And then a second question is for Dr. Trauschweizer. Within this kind of new military that was being formed from the ashes of their experiences in Vietnam, you talked a lot about the technologies that we were used, but I would like to hear a little bit more about how limited use of tactical nuclear warheads factored into this, and specifically how how the military may have envisaged those being used in a more European theater of operation versus what could potentially happen in the global South. Thank you.
Well, it's good questions. I think that, as Sergey just mentioned here, there's two different versions of communist movement, at least in Moscow. Conservative and liberal. Stalin believed, that the communist movement should be organized worldwide under the leadership of Soviet Union. That's why he created the International Congress of Communist Movement, provided detailed and instruction and aid to the countries like Vietnam for their revolution. And Khrushchev came to the power with a liberal communist movement. You do it on your own. We are not. He dismantled the Congress and stopped the aid, as Sergey mentioned here, to the countries like Vietnam, and you do by yourself. Somebody happy, believe they had a tight hand under Stalin's leadership, like Cuba and North Korea, and now they have a freedom to carry on their own agenda. So there were different versions of a communist movement. And Mao Zedong, as mentioned here, believed in an organized communist movement. So now we lost the leadership in Moscow. Beijing should be the next leader in the world.
Right. Thank you for that very interesting question. Also, very complicated one. I would say that early on, since Li Xiaobing went to Stalin's years, I should probably start there as well. And there's a really interesting period in the late 1940s, in fact, to be precise, 1949, when Stalin is trying to think about how to organize revolution in Asia. And there's discussion of the division of labor between the Soviet Union and China. And at one point, actually it was when Stalin's sidekick Anastas Mikoyan traveled to Xibaipo. This was shortly before the Chinese Revolution. Mikoyan travels to Xibaipo, meets with Mao Zedong, and discusses this question of the division of labor, and he brings with him instructions from Stalin. If you read those instructions, they're extremely interesting, because basically Stalin wanted the Chinese to take charge, to take control of Asian revolutions in Korea, North Korea, Japan, but not Vietnam. And you know why not Vietnam? He wanted the French Communist Party to be in charge of the revolution in Vietnam. And you think, really? At this point, 1949, he's still thinking in those terms. And there's also really interesting, fascinating discussion there in some of those documents that suggested that Stalin thought that Ho Chi Minh was actually an American spy. So he didn't trust Ho Chi Minh at all, but also he didn't want the Chinese to get involved there. And Ho Chi Minh, of course, was in his turn trying to win Stalin's trust. So in 1949, he traveled to Moscow. Or he also sent these loving letters to Stalin. We have them in the Russian archives. They're hilarious. Some of them are in English, some of them are in French. And he's like, dear comrade Stalin, sort of, I love you so much, etc. Literally, stuff like that. Then when you're moving into the 1950s and you have the period of beginning of rivalry between the Soviets and the Chinese, every movement or revolutionary movement in Asia becomes a target effectively for that rivalry, or becomes affected by this rivalry. And some of them try to stay clear from this, like the North Koreans are like, we don't want. Some of them lean one way or the other for reasons that are very interesting. So, for example, the Vietnamese started leaning to the Chinese direction in the early 1960s, and that is because they felt that the Soviet emphasis on peaceful coexistence doesn't work for them. I mean, they're trying to launch a military struggle in South Vietnam, or have already launched it, and so the whole business about peaceful coexistence, well, that's not for us, so therefore the Chinese would make more sense, but also they had to be careful not to overdo it, because the Soviets were obviously supplying weapons, not Khrushchev, but Brezhnev, and others were later supplying weapons. When does this change, and when do, the Chinese seem to be on the upswing in the early 1960s. You get to 1965, there's a collapse of Chinese influence. Sudden collapse, including in Vietnam. Not a collapse in Vietnam as much, but it was in Indonesia where it really was felt the most because of Aidit's defeat there, and that is very interesting. And so we have this remark, and that the Soviets, of course, looked at, for example, Indonesia then as a theater for struggle with the Chinese, and were trying in the immediate aftermath of the anti-communist crackdown there to reach out to the new Indonesian leadership. And we have very extensive documentation on how they were trying to establish good relations with a deeply reactionary government in Jakarta. Why? Because you know they thought they could outplay the Chinese in this kind of way, right? So I think this idea about different revolutionary visions is then subsumed, or actually falls by the wayside, because what you have instead is you have a struggle for influence, in geopolitical influence, and there in every of those theaters, China is a big player. The Soviets are trying to outplay China. They're trying to figure out how to do this. By hook or by crook, by providing weapons, by bad-mouthing the Chinese. And of course, the same goes for the other way. The Chinese also try to do the same thing.
Well, I guess very different tack. Although I have to say my mind is still on a Valentine's from Uncle Ho to Uncle Joe. I have to figure out how to work that into all classes from here on forward. Tactical nuclear weapons, Meg, the answer is, in an archival sense, we'll never know, because that's never going to be released. But of course, contextually, we have some sense, right? So there is, so Eisenhower very clearly in the 50s provides, what's the word here? This rarely happens to me. I can't think of it in German either. This is the odd thing. This might be a sign of aging. Pre-authorization for use of tactical nuclear weapons to NATO command, right? In theory, this works that a field commander has to call it in to higher headquarters. Higher headquarters call it to NATO. NATO calls, if it's nuclear, the White House, because the White House is the only authority on this within the alliance. And in the mid-50s, Eisenhower determines, well, that's not workable. And so clearly there is some pre-authorization, though we don't know how much. This gets complicated in the 60s by the flexible response strategy, which Europeans thought was maybe more conventional than nuclear. So what's clear for the 70s is that tactical nuclear weapons in the first half of the decade would have been a big factor in operational planning, but it's not spelled out. The US Army either never developed or certainly never publicized tactical nuclear doctrine for any decade. And so what's also clear is that by the late 70s, they're thinking, and early 80s, they're thinking more about conventional possibilities that might preclude the use of tactical nuclear weapons. But that's about as far, as close as to an answer as I think you'll get on that.
So I have a question for Dr. Li. So Dr. Li, you talked a little bit about how Mao and Lezuan met in 1975, and how Mao seemed very happy with what had happened in Vietnam, and but in the same year, the commander of the Royal Lao Army, General Bunpon Makteparat, had also visited Mao in China, and at that time, Mao and his people were telling him not to, that were saying a lot of negative things about the Vietnamese, and telling him not to go back to Laos, and that he could stay in China, and they would support him to live there as a kind of potential opposition, because they were concerned about Vietnamese influence in Laos. So there seems to be some contradictions about what the Chinese really thought about the Vietnamese at this time. Were they really, really happy with Lezuan, what was going on there, or were they already, having a sort of negative opinion about that, and maybe they would just, when they met him, they were maybe speaking openly in a kind of positive way, but behind the scenes, maybe they were more negative. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about what the Chinese were really thinking in 1975.
Thank you. It's very complicated questions. But the answer may be simple. At that point, Mao was really happy to complete the strategic transition from Soviet Union to US. So he tried to design this triangle, the large triangle, to dominate smaller triangle in Southeast Asia. So China like to keep a balance in Indo-China between Cambodia and Vietnam. So Laos played a very important role in this small triangle. But later, Mao gave up on Laos because of, like you mentioned, Vietnamese influence and Soviet support to the Laos. So Chinese are happy with the end of the war, but they know the problem will continue. So that's why Deng Xiaoping, the leader after Mao, decided to solve the problem with Vietnam instead with Laos. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question for Dr. Radchenko. Thank you for your talk. I'm interested, in 1967, there's an affair, a very famous affair in Vietnam called the Revisionist Anti-Party Affair. And there's a series of Vietnamese intellectuals and political figures that are arrested, many of whom are educated in the Soviet Union. And there's even like these potential rumors that potentially the Soviet Union was trying to like sponsor some type of revisionism in Vietnam, related maybe even to the Tet Offensive, and they cracked down on these officials, including one of whom is Ho Chi Minh's secretary and his son. And I'm curious, I'm just dying to know if you've come across anything related to that, or Soviet educated intellectuals in Vietnam, just more broadly.
So in broad terms, obviously, you know, the struggle between Soviet, what they see as Soviet and Chinese factions continues well beyond, I guess, well into the early 1970s. And the Soviets have their idea about who is who. They see Lizuan, for example, as deeply pro-Chinese, which does not prevent them later from improving relations with them. And Ho Chi Minh they see as basically playing both sides. And you see that struggle intensify in the run-up to the Tet Offensive, and even a little bit beyond that, at which point you have real, the Soviets start to win out in a major way, and the Chinese influence seems to be waning. And the Soviets, of course, are very happy with what they're seeing, because they see that their advice to Vietnam is being taken seriously. The Vietnamese are negotiating in Paris, and that is something that the Soviets are telling them to do. And the Chinese, of course, are complaining about this all the time, asking them, what are you doing in Paris? And you should not be negotiating, and so on and so forth. On this specific episode, I would have to double check. Of course, I have all the reports from the Soviet ambassador in Hanoi, Sherbakov, including for 1967, and I'm sure there's probably something there, but I cannot, I'd have to look it up, and then I can tell you.
Well, I have a question for Dr. Li and one for Dr. Radchenko. So for Dr. Radchenko, you mentioned that Soviet aid to Vietnam was a significant burden for the Soviet Union. And I was wondering if you could put that into kind of a more comparative context, like compared to Cuba, compared to Afghanistan later. How was it, compared to other cases of Soviet assistance? So what was the significance, of it for the change in the course of history for the Soviet Union? And then for Dr. Li, the question is about the war in Vietnam and its relations to the Chinese Cultural Revolution and the market reform under Deng Xiaoping as well. Was there any relationship between, like Chinese involvement in the war in Vietnam and, the Cultural Revolution? Any significant relationship, or maybe just something indirect, and also with the market reform under Deng Xiaoping as well? Thanks.
Vietnam War, we're talking about here from 65 to 73, 75, occurred at the same time during the Chinese Cultural Revolution, which was a national chaos in China. Mao turned the country upside down by himself against government officials and his lieutenant, and mobilized the young and youth like me into Red Guards. So many Red Guard actually crossed border on their own to Vietnam, joined Vietnamese army to fight against America as Chinese individuals. So, but this as a radical action domestically and internationally reflect Mao's idea about his version of the communist movement should be radical, violent, against America directly as much as possible. So that, as we mentioned here, undermined China's status and economy. So toward the end of the war, he changed his mind, or he was forced to shift his target from American to Soviet Union. And as a result, he brought back Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping already lost the job, worked as a manual labor in a tractor's factory with his wife as a worker for 5 years. Now Mao brought him back in 1975 to start reforming movement in China. So the war in Vietnam and the Cultural Revolution pretty much ended Mao's version of a communist movement in China and opened the door, or opened a new page for Deng's reform in 1975-78. Thank you.
So very, very interesting question about specific statistics. This is always difficult to pin down, and this for two reasons. Comparative statistics, because you have two types of Soviet aid to the socialist world. Some of it is economic aid, loans and things like that. You also have loans and grants, so those are difficult to pin down precisely because loans were often not repaid. So you don't know whether, how to calculate this. And then you also have military aid that is in a separate category. So I already mentioned about Vietnam's, the total aid in terms of economic aid to Vietnam until the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think I mentioned it was something like 16 billion rubles. Now, how does that compare to Cuba and Mongolia? Both of those countries were, by the way, major recipients of Soviet aid, and the Soviets complained endlessly. They were saying, look, they complained especially to their Comecon partners in Eastern Europe, saying, we are basically carrying the burden. You're not doing anything. We're helping the Cubans, we're helping the Mongolians, we're helping the Vietnamese. I cannot remember now. I think Vietnam was the biggest, actually, but Cuba was close second, and Mongolia was up there somewhere. But what I found, and this is interesting, I found the military supplies from the Soviet Union, figure for military supplies of the Soviet Union. That comes actually from Mikhail Gorbachev's personal papers that are available in Moscow. And by the way, when I say available, of course they're not available, because who can go there now? I was there in 2022 the last time around, but if I would try to go there now, I'd probably get arrested and put away for 30 years. But technically they're available. If somebody dares to go, I suppose. And so we have the figures for Soviet supply of military aid to its allies from 86 to 1990. And what you see here is that Vietnam was actually, in terms of, at least from 86 to 90, was not even a major recipient. I mean, it was a major recipient. It got 2.2 billion rubles worth of military aid. Compared to, let's say, Iraq, 5.4 billion. But here's a fun fact. The Iraqis paid for it. The Vietnamese didn't, right? So 2.2 becomes much more expensive than 5.4, because 5.4 for Iraq, the Iraqis paid for it with oil. But you've got 1.6 for North Korea, 2.2 for Vietnam, 3.9 for Cuba. something like 7 billion for India, Libya 1.9, but some of that was being repaid. In other words, some of those countries that had oil, they paid for Soviet weapons, but Vietnam, Cuba, they basically worked on credit, and those credits were never repaid.
Yeah, just a quick historiographical question for Professor Radchenko. At the start of your presentation, you said, the Soviet archives open at this early period, and then we get the work of Guy Duk, right? A couple of books in the late 90s, early 2000s. Then there's a second period of opening, 2014. I wonder, could you talk about the kind of range of scholars and works that have made the best use of that 2014 work? Is that stuff in English? Is it in Russian? Who are the names? If we want to see the fruits of that opening, where should we look?
So that's the sad story is when the stuff opened, it was available, it was widely available, but there was nobody there. I was sitting there all by myself effectively for years, and occasionally some other Western scholars would turn up, like Mark Kramer would turn up there, and so Mark Kramer and I spent a lot of time together in those archives. I don't know that Mark Kramer has published anything on that basis, or he must have, but not books. Necessarily, I would have to double check. But then you have you have people like Natalia Telepneva, who published a book just recently came out last year about the Soviet involvement in Africa. So that is, she used all the Soviet archives for the 1970s to show in great detail of what the Soviets were doing in Africa. On Vietnam, no one has done that. In fact, I can tell you, I'm sitting on thousands of pages of this Vietnamese materials, and I didn't really do anything with them either. But that's just a fraction of the stuff that is available there, or that was available there. And I think that if properly processed and understood, would really reshape our view of the history of that period of Southeast Asian history. So I'm just hoping that that there's going to be interest in that, and maybe something can be organized in the way where we can actually use some of at least the materials that I got from there, which is tens of thousands of pages, really try to do something with them, because I'm certainly not doing anything with them.
Last question. Okay. My question's for Dr. Radchenko. I was just curious. You talked about how Brezhnev from like 1974 was just in terrible health, and the leaders after him also were in pretty much terrible health. So I was just curious, from that period where the Soviet leaders were just in pretty much horrible health, does your source material kind of have like a dead gap in that period where there's not really a lot like there because they're just in such terrible health?
Yeah, so it is remarkable, because you see the impact of health on power, and you see it directly and immediately in a way that almost shocks you, because here you have a guy who's really engaging and really is able to discuss all sorts of things and is really able to shape Soviet foreign policy in ways that are important and consequential. And then suddenly he just drops from view, and he's just not there anymore. You have then basically, he's still there, I mean, he's physically there, right? They roll him into the meetings, and he reads out from little sets of prepared cards. The cards are in the archives, and so he reads from the cards, and then when the other, so he reads for a little bit, and then the other side asks a question, and then he's like, okay, where are my cards to answer this, And sometimes it doesn't actually work, because they don't have a card for every question, so it's just ridiculous actually to read this. So yeah, there is, you still see a lot of materials, because you have preparatory materials and you have a massive amount of materials in the Central Committee that were declassified, including for Vietnam. And so those of you who are interested in this, the finding aid for the Russian Party archives is actually online, so you can actually view the stuff that is there. The only thing is you have to have a Russian VPN. Now, you can actually find there are online services that do that for free. I don't know how safe it is to download them, or but I have certainly tried to do that. And so you can go there, and you can search using years as well, and then you'll see also the amount of pages, the years, and everything in different different fonts, as they're called. The problem is now accessing those materials, because again, how can you go there? I cannot encourage any of my graduate students to go there. I cannot go there, and universities will not pay for hiring research assistants because it would violate sanctions. So.
Thank you, everyone, for coming to this morning's panel for the Baker Peace Conference, and we hope you will join us at 3 p.m. today for the final panel on Southeast Asian allies. Please join me in one more round of applause for today's speaker.